You are live.
Okay, this session is the recording for lecture 9, session 9, that we were to have looked at, and it is about how to conduct a word study. And this is important because we are going to have to deal and contend with words as we try to understand what scripture is teaching to us. So this class is going to be about providing you with a comprehensive approach, some principles that you will need to make your study of God's word more meaningful. And so we will go through the steps and all that is necessary in helping you to conduct this word study. There is a chapter in Rhodes about word studies, and I would invite you to, along with this class, along with this lecture, along with this session, that you read that chapter from Rhodes on conducting a word study, because it will, again, it will expand your knowledge. So let us go into what is involved here. I want to attempt 5 things here as we look at how do we go about conducting a word study. First of all, we are going to be looking at what do we mean when we say that we are involved in doing a word study. It might seem obvious, it might seem rather, almost like an axiom, very clear, self-explanatory, so to speak. But if we understand what we are talking about and what we're doing and why we're doing what we're doing when we engage in a word study, it will better help us in that study. So in order for us to benefit from such an experience of studying words as they are used in scripture, then we need to understand certain concepts. There are going to be certain jargons, if you wish, that is language that is peculiar to a subject area. There is going to be particular jargons that you must understand, that you must grapple with, that you must come to terms with if you are going to have a meaningful experience in studying words as a means of building not only your congregation and your teaching, but also that it will help to build your personal and private devotions. So what are the concepts, jargons, if you wish, of word studies, and things that are involved in a word study? And then we want to move on to what are some of the principles that govern. What are some of the principles that must be respected? What are some of the principles that we need to understand if we are going to make our word studies meaningful? And so we will move from that point to looking at methodologies and approaches, because I don't want us to go away thinking that there's only one way to approach this exercise, because there are many ways. There are different ways in which we can approach a word study of scripture. And then we will end the class by looking at certain of the tools that will help us in our word studies. You will remember that in an earlier class, we did look at the tools that are involved in hermeneutics. We looked at things like Bible maps, we looked at handbooks, we looked at all of those things. But in this class, I want to look at the specific references, the specific sources that we can look at as we conduct this word study. So the tools that I'm going to introduce you to are the tools that are specific to word studies. Now, here is a definition of what we mean by word studies and what is involved in actually doing a word study. Based on the definition, what we are going to be doing, it is about, word study is about analyzing a key word in the original language. We're looking at the original language, Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic. We're looking at the original language in which the Bible was written. And by looking at that original language, we are better able to identify, we're better able to uncover, we're better able to come to terms, and it will give us a fulsome, a complete biblical meaning. And why is this important? Because if we misunderstand the words that are being used, if we do, because you see, we communicate in words. I know that there is sign language and all of that, all right? But we communicate with words, and words carry certain information. Not only that words carry certain information, but words also carry certain ideas. It carries certain perspectives, because let me just give you an example of what we mean when we talk about, when we analyze the original language, we're trying to uncover and it gives us a complete biblical meaning. There is a difference between, and I usually ask this question, I think I might have asked the question in class before, do you live in a house or do you live in a home? You see, in the words house and home, there are subtle differences, there are ideas, there are concepts that are being communicated to us. And if we do not and are not able to make the distinction between how words are packed with information and ideas, then we are limiting our understanding of the biblical message. So when we are talking about a word study, we're trying to uncover in the original language the biblical meaning of a word. Not only that, words are building blocks. So we move from a word to a phrase, to a sentence, to an idea, and although an idea is involved in all of those, but it is the building blocks on which we move to understand the text, because and we will come to this in this class, talking about the hermeneutical cycle, that the words that are used within a text, they carry, as I said before, certain information that we will need. So when we talk about analyzing a word, what we're looking for is the building blocks of a text. So we can't really look at a text if we don't look at the words. All right? And another part to this, and another aspect of this, is that not just in Bible, but words symbolize ideas. They stand for ideas. I know there's a and this is just a sidebar. We ask the question: is thought? Can we think without language? Can we think without words? And there's a big debate as to whether or not we can do that. But that's in linguistics. I will not do that now. But the idea is that words symbolize a particular idea or a subject. All right? And that is why it's important that we deal with, we understand what we're doing when we're talking about us engaged in a word study. Okay. Having done that now, what's the purpose? Why does this matter? Um, is there any goal to this? And if we can understand um, the importance of doing a word study, then there are certain things that will come alive to us that might not have come alive to us had we not been engaged in this kind of issue. Now, so here are some purposes why word studies are important, why as we deal with study of a word, we, what's the purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to get at? And one of the purposes is in a word study, it helps us to sift. It helps us to discern meaning. Well, what does this word mean? What does it mean in this context? What does it mean in another context? What does it mean for doctrine? So, for instance, a study of the word redemption would be fascinating. Um, so, there are certain concepts, theological concepts in scripture that a word study will unveil for us um, these concepts. So we say that one of the purposes of engaging is this in this kind of approach, in this kind of Bible study, is that it helps us as students of the word to discern meaning. But not only that, what it also does is that there are certain theological teachings, there are certain doctrinal, if you wish, teaching that are important in God's revelation that a word study will give us key ideas and understanding. So, for instance, I love this. This is something that I've always been fascinated with, and I've done some amount of study on it, but not complete. The words, think about this. The words that are used in relationship to our salvation. And think about the different words that we can grapple with as we deal with our salvation. Okay, we're told that we have been redeemed. Well, we have been told not only that we have been redeemed, but that we have been saved. We're not only redeemed and saved, but we're told that we're forgiven. Well, we're saved, we're redeemed, we're forgiven. But another concept in our salvation is that we have been sanctified. Another concept of our salvation is that we have been adopted. Now, if we look at these terms, forgiveness, redemption, sanctification, and we look at our being adopted, what's the difference between our being forgiven as against our being saved? It's the same concept of the idea that we have been, the guilt of our sins have been taken away. That's the same concept. But when I say that we are saved, or that when you say that we're saved, it carries the idea that my sins put me in danger and I have to be rescued. When it says that I have been forgiven, it means that the obligation that I have, some obligation on my part, has been taken away, forgiven, wiped out. And therefore, I am now been reconciled. The idea in reconciliation is not the same idea in salvation. You see what I'm saying? Reconciliation suggests that there is some enmity between two parties and they have now come back in agreement. So this is what I'm saying. When we discuss these ideas in a word study, and when we engage in a word study, we are better able to deal with the theological, the doctrinal significance of scriptural terms. All right. So that is one. Another purpose why we're engaged in a word study is that it helps us to understand the language. And one of the scholars in the Brotherhood, Everett Ferguson, in his book about church history, he said something that struck me, and I'm using that in this regard. He asks a question: why do we study history? And he makes the point that when we are discussing about history, we're not just discussing concepts, dates, and times. We're studying people. And I thought that that was such a deep thought, because I've never seen history as studying of people. I've always been bogged down with the date that this happened, the sequence of events. But he says that when history is all about people, and if you don't love people, then you won't love history. All right? That's a historian talking. When it says we're examining the original language, we are actually talking about how people communicated with each other and how God communicated with his creation at the time of that communication. It's about God's message. So when we study the language, we're looking at how is it that God is communicating information to us. We want to see the pattern of usage, how words are used within their context and maybe sometimes out of their context. And also, when we do a word study, we are getting some amount of insight into the cultural features of the day, of the cultural factors that impinge on the use of this language. So this is one of the reasons why we need to be engaged in a study, in a word study. The other purpose for a word study is it helps us to develop a deeper understanding of the biblical text, and that's clear. And lastly, though these are not all the purposes, but these are the ones I want to emphasize, it validates the lexicon. What do I mean by that? We have to sometimes be very conscious and be very aware that while a lexicon is meant to give information about words or to define a word, sometimes we have to be careful how we take on a lexical dictionary kind of a meaning of a word, because you know why? These lexicographers, they will give you the, I will come to this term, the denotation, the primary meaning of the word. But then they will move on from that and give and impose their interpretation of the meaning of a word. So they're not just giving you the meaning of the word, they're also giving you their interpretation of that meaning. And sometimes they force their doctrinal, theological bias into the meaning of the word. I think it was Robertson, and I stand corrected, where he says theology must give way to grammar. That's a dangerous statement. All right, but the whole idea is, and that statement has a whole lot of implication. for teaching. But when we are engaged in a word study, we are validating the lexicon, because then we're pulling different things from different places to emphasize what a word is saying. And that's some of the reasons why we are engaged in a word study. All right. A rationale for word study. And you might say, isn't rationale the same thing as a purpose? I would want to make a distinction in the words, since we're doing a word study. All right. Now, there's a certain rationale that we need to look at. And when we engage in a word study, what we're actually, the intention is that we're trying to get at, we're trying to determine the precise meaning of a term. We're trying to get, what does this word really mean? But more importantly, what does this word mean in the context in which it was said? Because we're going to look at it again later on in this class. The idea that it is the context that is going to define and say what a word means. Because a word does not exist. Okay, words are context bound. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I can use the word table. Depending on the context that I'm using that word, it changes its meaning. Am I talking about a piece of furniture? Or am I talking about getting my child to learn or to know his times table? If I were involved in geography, then I am going to try to protect the water table. Now, the water table is not a table made of a piece of furniture made of water, right? So in each of these contexts, the word table takes on a different meaning. I can talk about parliamentarians tabling a bill. It doesn't mean that they're trying to make a proposed legislation a piece of furniture, or they're trying to make it a periodic table in chemistry. So the whole idea is that when we are involved in word studies, we are trying to get at the precise meaning within the given context in which the word is used. Now, in this situation, as we engage in a word study, it helps us to minimize our misinterpretation of a text. Because if we do not understand how the word is being used in a text, we will misunderstand, misapply, misinterpret what the text is teaching. All right? I made this point earlier, and I'm making again, that it uncovers and it gives us the doctrinal support for our teaching. And that sounds redundant, because doctrinal support is for our teaching. In other words, we're teaching something. We're saying that we're making a claim that the Bible teaches this. A word study will help us to either verify or dismantle a meaning. All right? We can either verify or invalidate a meaning. And so word studies, a part of it, it's to give us a support for what we teach, because that support comes in the scriptural language, the words that the scriptures are using. And here is something. When we're engaged in a word study, It helps us and it gives quality, it gives depth to our personal study and our biblical instruction, whether we're teaching or preaching, or teaching one-on-one, or teaching a whole class, or preaching out to a congregation. And one of the things I want us and you who are intending to be preachers, you need to challenge your audience. Your preaching must be textual. And by that I mean, I'm not making the distinction between a textual sermon and an expository or a topical sermon. That's not my point. In other words, what should shape your preaching, what should shape your teaching, is the text. I don't want to go on a rampage with all of this and go on my hobby horse, but there are sometimes, sadly, too many sermons that are about illustration, about stories, about jokes, about opinions, and little about this is what the text is saying. And I said, I'm not talking about now whether you're going to teach a textual, a topical, or express sermon. That's not what I'm talking about. In other words, your lesson, your teaching should be based on the text. It should try to reveal, it should try to exegete from the text what the text is saying. All right? And a word study helps you to give depth to that teaching and preaching. All right? Enough of that said. When we are engaged in a word study, what it also does for us, it gives us a better ability. It hones our skills in how to use the lexicon, because we're going to have to go deep in terms of the lexicon, the Bible dictionary, all of that kind of a thing. We are better able to, a lexicon, a dictionary, and these resources will not become unfamiliar to us, because we are actually we would have had, as the Hebrew writer says, or exercise, or our minds exercised, because we have been dealing with word studies. All right. Now, let us move now from the purpose and the rationale. Let us now consider certain concepts that are embedded in a word study. Some concepts that we need to know as we look at a word study. First of all, we need to understand that words have denotative meaning. And I alluded to this earlier, that words have denotative meaning. And what is that? Words have a primary meaning. All right? There are some core meanings of a word. That is its primary meaning. As I said with the illustration, I can talk about a home as different from a house. All right. So that denotation of the word is its primary core meaning. But words also have connotations, and that is, words are packed with values. It's packed with associations, and it's packed with feelings. So a word can unveil a particular association. All right. I can say, this idea, I don't know if you would have heard it, and if you not, let me just, this saying, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words cannot hurt me. That's not true. Because words carry values and attitudes and feeling. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I can say, in fact, this is a common, I hate to use this, but they have changed the meaning of gay, because basically the word means happy. But that word now has built up certain connotation behind it. All right. And so you'll understand what I mean in terms of words having connotation. There's also something else about a concept in the word that we need to look at, and that is we can be engaged in semantics. Now, there are two concepts in semantics. Semantics can refer to a branch of linguistics. So when I'm studying a language, I am studying a couple of things. I'm studying the phonology of the language, that is the sound of the language. And so there's a branch of linguistics called phonology, sound. I can deal with the morphology in linguistics, that is how words are formed, And I remember when I was in university doing linguistics, I'll never forget what the teacher said in defining a morpheme. and all that I can remember out of all of that class is the morpheme is the smallest unit of a word. All right, but we can look at the morphology of a language. That's one aspect of linguistics. Semantics is another aspect of linguistics. All right, as different from its phonology or its whatever. But we can also look at semantics as the meaning of words. What do the words mean? Good. But then, as we look at the meaning of a word, we can talk about the semantic range of a word. And this is important. We can talk about the semantic range of a word. What does that mean? Basically, it is the idea that there are words, we can use a word in a variety of ways. All right? The semantic range of a word is the different ways in which a word is used. I just talk about table. So the semantic range of a table would be water table. It can be that it is used in different context. All right, it is used in different ways. I can use the word walk. I can strut. I can lumber as I walk along. I can stroll. Those are the semantic range of the word run. So the word is used in a variety of ways. It's understood in a variety of ways. But now what determines that? It's usage, how it is used, its context, the context in which it is used, and the cultural factors that shape how that word is used. All right. Let me give you a particular case from Jamaica. If you were to go to Jamaica and somebody was to say to you that you are craven. Now, the English word craven means coward, but Jamaicans do not use it in that sense. If you go to Jamaica and somebody says that you're craven, it means that you're greedy. All right. So there are cultural factors. Why do they make that mistake? Because they have used the idea of a craving for and use it as great. But anyway, I'm not teaching linguistics now anyway. But the whole idea is that it has a semantic range. Words are used in a variety of ways, depending on the context, depending on how it is used and all of that. All right. So that is one concept that we must become familiar with, that words have a range of meaning. Another concept that I want us to at least be conscious of, not going into any depth with it, but I want us to be aware of this concept. Words have what we call synchronistic perspective. We can study a word synchronistically, if that's a word that exists. Now, what does that mean? It is where I am studying the word from the time period in which it is used. How was the word used at the time that it was spoken? All right, from the in the time, in the era that it was spoken, which can talk about the synchronistic study of a word, how the word was used at the time period that it was. How did the people understand it in their day? All right. We can also study a word diachronically, or from the diachronic perspective. And what's that? It's where we compare how the word was used at the time it was first rendered and how it is being used in its sense now. So we're taking the idea from how it was used then and transferring that idea into how it is used now. All right. So we're talking about the diachronic perspective. So we compare how the word has been used over time by comparing how it was used in older time as against how it is being used contemporarily now, in this instance now. So I want us to be able to at least be familiar with those terms. All right. Okay. Another concept that I want us to look at is the whole idea of etymology. So this is another concept of the word that I need, because it is going to be a very important aspect of word study. And we can talk about, and we have in the past spoken about, etymological fallacies, root fallacies. All right. What is etymology? It's a study of compound words, how these words are formed. All right. It's a study of compound words and word formation. How are the words formed? So give you a looking at the etymology of a word, how we can break down a word. For instance, if I were to talk about, for instance, a cardiologist, I can break down the word and say, okay, the word cardio means heart. Ology has to do with the study of. So a cardiologist is someone who is concerned with matters of the heart. All right. So what I've done, I've looked at how, and I can say, well, in older time, the word was used like cardio meant that, and I can split it out like that. That's what I'm doing when I'm engaged in etymology. And I'm looking at how these words are formed. And what I do in an etymological study of a word is where I appeal to the meaning of the Greek and the Hebrew of the original, that is original Hebrew and Greek, to try to determine what the word means. No, there are flaws in that, by the way, and we have looked at that already. But that is basically what we're involved when we do etymology, and I want us to be conscious of that. I'm going to say something more about etymology. Well, here it is. We need to be careful that we do not go to either extreme as we study this concept in word studies called etymology. In the first place, an etymological study has its flaws, but it also has its positives, its strengths. All right? We can engage in etymological fallacy as we study root fallacy of a word. However, that must not blind our eyes to the fact that there is value in it if we know how best to engage in a study of this sort. So what are some of the flaws of an etymological approach to word study? Number one, let's look at the flaws. It can push us into the area of fallacious reasoning. And we have seen that when we talked about the fallacies of interpretation. All right. Now, a cupboard is made up of two words, cup and board. It does not mean that the cup is made out of a board or the board is made, or the cup is made of a board. No. All right. So we can, as we try to break down the word formation, we can in fact engage in fallacious reasoning. There is a danger in our over-reliance on word origins. Why? Because though the word might originally have meant that, words change over time. Meanings change over time. And one of the best examples I find is sallow, the Greek word sallow. And the argument is used to mean that sallow in Ephesians 5:19 means that because it was used, sallow means to pluck an instrument, then Ephesians 5:19 is giving us the right to play an instrument in public worship. That's false. Why? Because the word, by the time of Jesus Christ, the word sallow had changed its meaning. And not only that, the instrument in which we're asked to pluck, in the very passage, it tells us what it is, not strings of an instrument, not a guitar or a flute or cello, but it's the harp. Anyway, be that as it may. One of the flaws of an over-reliance on etymological study is where we fail to consider, as I said, that meaning shifts and context determines meaning. All right? And what the flaws are, though, is that the inferences from which we draw those words can be misled, mistaken, and in fact, as I said here, unwarranted. All right? Be that as it may, though, etymology as an approach to word study also has strengths. It has strengths. In fact, one of the strengths is that if we're engaged in such a study and we know how, in fact, to deal with it correctly, it furnishes us with valuable illustrative material. All right? It really provides and unlocks us a wealth of illustration in terms of words. All right? Um, Another strength is that it gives us a clue or shade of meaning of a word. And of course, in etymology, we can discover the meanings of rare and obscure words, which will help us to illustrate a point. But as I said, we have to be careful because it has some flaws of its own. All right. Now, this is important. When we talk, another concept that we need to, as we deal with the word study, that we need to be very conscious of is what is called the hermeneutical cycle. The hermeneutical cycle. Now, when we're studying a word, here is what we must be very conscious of. The context, watch me, the context determines the meaning of an individual word. I've been drilling this point over and over. The context determines the meaning of the word, but also the meaning of the context at the same time is determined by the meaning of the individual word. So it's almost like, I don't want to say, well, let me say a vicious cycle. So the word, how the word is used depends on the context, but the word also gives meaning to the context. So that is what we call the hermeneutical cycle, and it's very important that we understand that. All right, and I'm driving this one home. All right. Now then, having looked at a definition of word studies, what we are involved in, having looked at the purpose and the rationale for why we're doing what we're doing in word studies, and developing a sort of understanding of what is involved in word studies. Now let's look at certain principles that we must respect, that we must be conscious of as we engage in word study. Number one, a word study should be inductive. What do I mean by that? I want to find out what is the meaning, what this word means. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to consider the semantic range of the word. So I'm going to pull all of the evidence that I can find about how that word is used, and I'm going to study that word in its different contexts. So I'm going to look at the range of meanings of the word, and I'm going to study it so that I can determine what does it mean in this text. All right? And I'm going to show you that. I'm going to illustrate that pretty shortly. Looking at the semantic range, it is inductive. I'm gathering all of the evidence, and from that evidence, I'm going to say this is what the word means. Not only must I do that, I must also categorize its usage. In other words, it's used this way here, it's used this way here, it's used this way here. So I have this whole thing before me, and I'm saying now, how does this word as is used in this context, does it fit in this one? All right, so I am going to categorize how the word is used in the different ways in which it is used. Now, after all that is done, then I'm going to say in this passage that I am considering, in this passage, in this text that I am studying, this is what the word means. This is the implication of the word, right? So I'm going to bring all of the evidence and I'm going to link it to the passage, the text that I'm studying, and I'm going to say, this is what it says. This is what it means. All right? Now, here is another principle about word studies. And I'm going to illustrate it with this word, that words are always context bound. And the word is used differently in different contexts. Now, let us look at some of this. All right? Let's take the word flesh and how the word is used differently in different contexts. I won't read all of the passages, but I want to show you how this principle works. We're studying the word flesh. Well, the flesh can mean the literal physical body. And that's how it is being used in Luke, Hebrews, and Revelation, the passages that I have here. So it can be used to mean my physical body. All right? It can mean humanity. It can mean the human being. All right? So John would tell us that, or I think John, all flesh is as grass. John 1:14, the word became flesh. The word became a human being. All right? So it is used in its literal sense, meaning the physical body, but it is also can be used to mean humanity or human beings. The word flesh can also be used to mean earthly descent or kingship. The two shall become one flesh. All right? There again, the word is being used differently. So it can also mean weakness or physical frailty. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. All right? It can mean weakness, morality, or physical. In fact, I'm repeating myself here. Physical frailty. All right. I'm repeating myself there. But also, it can mean the physical versus the spiritual. Okay. Now, the works of the flesh are these. And it can mean a difference between my physical existence and my spiritual existence. So the word flesh is used differently, and that is why one of the principles of word study is to recognize and remember that words have are context bound. Okay. Now, here's another thing. We must study the word historically. Another way is to consider that a word study should be historical. Now, let's take the word anathema. All right. Now, originally, anathema was used to refer to an offering that was given to fulfill a vow. That is anathema. Okay? As we follow and trace the meaning of the word, we realize that the word changed its meaning to mean something that is accursed. You give it to your deity, but it becomes an accursed thing. In the Septuagint, anathema meant a thing devoted to God for destruction. It means a thing that was accursed. And those are the references there in Numbers, in Deuteronomy, and Joshua. In the New Testament, Paul uses the word anathema to describe one who is under the curse of God. Let him be, if any man comes and teaches another doctrine, let him be anathema. So what is the point? A word study of this nature bolsters and adds depth, adds scholarship to our lesson. And by scholarship, I don't mean that you're going to preach above the heads of the audience. That's not going to help anybody. And just a sidebar too. I remember when I was as a Christian, I went to a gospel meeting when I was living in Jamaica. And there is this preacher who is talking about that God is long suffering. And I don't know what got into him, but he's trying to explain to the audience what long suffering is. And I sat there, and for about 4 or 5 minutes, he went into the Greek to look at how the word was used and what this Greek word means and what this. And I sat there and I was like, why? That's not necessary. I said, why don't you just change? I said in my mind, I said, why don't you just switch the word around? God suffers long. Here is what I'm saying to you, right? You can add scholarship to your lessons, depth to your lessons, that will educate your congregation, educate the person you're studying with. But don't use what you have learned in terms of the study of a word to show how much Greek or Hebrew you know. That's not scholarship. By that I mean, if the audience, you can preach above their heads. I'm not suggesting that there's not a time when you're going to have to go down into Greek and explain something about it. I'm not talking about that. But it is one of the arsenals that you will have, that in preparing for your study, in preparing for your own personal development, in preparing for your sharing the truth, whether in one-on-one or to 1,000 people, that when we engage in this kind of a study, word study, it does lift our lessons, right? And in fact, as you know, one of the mantras of the school is to emphasize the whole aspect of scholarship, and this is one of the ways that we can do it without talking above people's head. All right, just my hobby hours. All right. Now here's another principle. I want to show you this word. I found this word fascinating, and it is the word scholar. And this is what I'm talking about, how the word is used and how words change over time, how words add meaning, and we look at the historical setting of word. And I love this. I'm sorry, but I just, all right. The word scholar, yes, you say you're a scholar. The word scholar originally meant to have leisure or spare time. That's leisure. That's what a scholar was, or the verb. All right. Now, over time, the word scholar was used to describe the time that was dedicated to an activity that was associated with academic pursuits. So you became a scholar because you spent time studying. The word moved from that, and Paul uses the word in 1 Corinthians 7:5, referring to focusing on prayer without personal distractions. Now, if you are going to add value and meaning to your sermon, this kind of information, not necessarily in scholar, but information such as this, will help you to build your, I'm saying it, to build your own study of God's word, your own understanding of God's word. So here is the point. It's not only essential to trace a word's history, here's a caution, but it is also to be able to delineate the possible meanings that are contemporary with the New Testament period. What do I mean by that? The question, saying all of that, this is what I'm saying. When we come to look at a word study, one of the questions we must ask is, what did it mean at the time it was used? And that becomes important. But to see the word changing meaning over time will help you and open your eyes to a lot of information. Here's another thing that I want us to look at, and that is usage. And we're making the point here that usage determines the meaning of a word. How the word is used determines its meaning. I think it was Alice in Wonderland that says, when I use a word, it means what I want it to mean. All right. Anyway, but how is the word used? Now, as we look at word usage, we must determine the intended meaning of the speaker. We must determine how did the audience understand the word, the meaning as it was used. We have said this before, I'm saying it again. We would then, one of the principles as we do this is to locate every place the word is used and apply the general word reference to the context of the text. Another thing that we need to look at is we need to delimit the meaning of the word. Limit the word to this particular text, because it is used other places, yes, but what does it mean in this text? All right. And we must also give attention to the study of synonyms. And we have, like, I should have put it on this, the idea of trench has a very good synonyms of the Old Testament and synonyms of the New Testament. Trench, and I think Girdlestone has the same thing. Those words are useful. All right. What are some of the things that we must consider in word studies? We must consider the particular referent, what is being addressed, what is being pointed to. Context determines the referent, and it determines the sense. And we must determine the sense of the word in its semantic range. Another consideration that we must make here is that words usually have only one sense in any specific literary context, one sense. We must keep in mind too that the meaning of words change over time. We saw that in scholarship, we saw that in the idea of anathema. We must also bear in mind that etymology is never a reliable guide to meaning, that there are some flaws and limitations there. We need to understand, as we look at it, that the meaning of a word is determined by two things. One, its contemporary semantic range and the literary context in which it is used. All right. Now, let's look at some approaches that we can use in word study. And these approaches, I'm going to give you a variety of them because one size doesn't fit all. You're studying a word, trying to determine what it means and the concept and the theology behind it and all of that. First of all, you need to understand the meaning of the word. All right? Then limit the possible meanings it might have. Then we're going to eliminate the various possibilities until we can be certain of how the word is used in that particular sentence. Now, after we've ascertained what the word means, all right, this word is spelled correctly, we must determine its usage in the passage. Yes, it might mean somewhere elsewhere, but how is it used in this passage? That's one approach that we're going to. So we're going to try to understand the meaning of the word, limit the possible meanings it might have, eliminate the various possibilities, and then see what it means in that particular passage. All right? That's an approach to usage. Okay. We can also be involved in a lexical analysis. So we need, as we do the word studies, identify the general literal form. Is this poetry? Is this prose? Because of course, those will determine how words are used. Words might be used figuratively or they might be used literally. We need to trace the development of the author's theme. That might be, how is the word used throughout this book? How does Paul, how does Peter use this word within the book? How is it being used? All right. Now, so we need to examine how the passage under consideration ties into the context. All right. Determine what the individual words mean. Then we need to look at their synonyms and their semantic range. That is, look at the variety of the meanings of a word and how the word is used in the ancient and or secular literature. That's important because that will give us a clue as to what we are discussing. All right? Okay. And what word we're trying to find. Now, I want to suggest that this is an approach that is basically almost, if you say, very exhaustive and very foolproof. I'm studying the word, let's say I'm studying the word redemption. All right? I'm going to try to find the root meaning. And this is where etymology will come in, but we need to look at it carefully. We need to look at how the history of the word and all of that. So I'm doing redemption. So I need, here's one approach. I'm going to look at the classical usage. What do I mean by that? I'm going to try to find out what the word meant in the classical literature. That is the literature of the word outside of the New Testament, outside if you wish, outside of the Old Testament, but outside of the New Testament. That's the classical usage of the word. So I'm going to try to find the root meaning. I'm going to look at the classical usage, but I'm also going to look at the koine usage. That is the Greek, how the Greeks used it. Now, how is the word used by the common man at the time, the koine usage? Then I'm going to be looking for another step. After I've done that, it would be useful to look at the Septuagint. In other words, how was the word used in the Old Testament? What's the related word in the Old Testament? And when that word is transferred from the Old Testament into the New Testament Greek, how is the Old Testament translated? How it is used? Because it will give us an idea of how its counterpart in the Old Testament Hebrew, and how that Hebrew word is taken over into the Greek. So I'm going to look at the Septuagint, right? Old Testament translation into the New. And I'm also going to look at the New Testament usage. How is this word being used in the New Testament in this passage? So I'm going to try to find the root meaning. I'm going to try to find the classical usage, how it is used among the Greeks of the day. I'm going to look at the Septuagint and its counterpart in the Hebrew. That is, how is this Hebrew word, its equivalent, transferred into the Greek and what it means. And then I'm going to look at how the word is used in the New Testament. That is in the passage that I'm talking about. This is another approach that would be very helpful. Now, if you have been reading Rhodes, which I think you should be doing, and not think, but you should be doing, is Rhodes has this approach. He says, determine the possible translation of a word, consider the synonyms, consider its origin, examine each occurrence of the word, look at the Old Testament usage, what we have just been saying, look at its New Testament usage, decide its distinctive meaning. We're going to consult scholarly works to bolster our insight about the meaning. So we're going to go to our lexicons or word study material and all of that. We're then going to summarize our study and then apply the conclusion to where the word appears in text. This is Rhodes' approach to word studies. Now, we're coming down now to what are some of the resources that are available to us in our word study. I want to suggest that we can use concordances. So we can use Strong's Concordance, we can use Young's Concordance, and we can use Bible Gateway. All right? We can use lexicons. For instance, Brown, Drive, and Briggs for Hebrew. We can look at Thayer's lexicon, although there are later word studies lexicons after Thayer. We can look at interliner Bibles. Some of these we have covered in the class that we did when we were looking at tools for Bible study. We can look at Bible dictionaries. There are some useful word studies in the available to us. We can look at West's word studies. We can look at Vincent word studies. All of those word studies would also help us. We can look at theological dictionaries, like, for instance, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. We can also look at commentaries. All right. If we're going to go for internet material, Logos is very useful, and we can use Blue Letter Bible. So all of these resources that we have that can be used to teach and help us to understand the word studies and help us in our word study. All right. Now, let us look at now the conclusion here as we look at what word studies are. Engaging in word study is going to be essential. All right. For these reasons. One, it helps us to have sound biblical interpretation. It guards us against superficial readings and doctrinal errors. It helps us to illuminate subtle distinctions and theological concepts. And it enhances the richness of our preaching, teaching, and personal devotion. Now, word studies honor the integrity of God's communication. It facilitates the faithful discernment of the message and ensures meaningful application within the community. I think that's what I have here. The idea is that it helps us to make meaningful application. All right. So this is what I want to say about word studies, and I am hoping that this has been beneficial. Again, I am going to encourage you to read the text that we have on this, and that is Rhodes. He has a study, he has a chapter on word studies, which I invite you to read. Okay, thank you.